Okay, with Luke Creely, The Farmhouse is a short film played at the Horror Underground Festival, 15 minutes long. Really good film, man. You wrote this screenplay, right? Was it always designed to be like a short film like this?
Yes, thank you for having me on
Yeah.
firstly, and appreciate your words and glad you enjoyed the film. Yes, it was always meant to be a short film. Obviously, with short film creation, you always sort of make them and script them and craft them so that there could be a potential feature
Yeah.
down the road. So there is, I think, a potential world that could be constructed in feature film format. I think particularly with the Kylie character and maybe some of more of her backstory. But for what it was, yes, a short film is what it was meant to be, and yeah, the 15-minute time frame.
But it's the feature film or the limited series or whatever you want to call it hasn't been written yet. It's just a short film that's been written.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, so
Okay.
just the short film at this stage. There's always ideas circulating,
Yeah.
uh, but at the moment, just the short film. Nothing has been put to paper yet.
And what do you remember how you came up with this idea? Like, where you kind of this concept?
Yeah, I've always been very interested in exploring trauma in film. My other short films have always looked at trauma and characters that are grappling with trauma and how that trauma can be manifested on screen through the horror format, through violence and through gore and through other sort of supernatural elements. So in terms of an actual conception, there wasn't really anything specific other than just an interest in exploring trauma through that frame. And also really just thinking about what it would be like if someone was entrapped in an isolated environment, if they were in a particular space where there was no one else around, they were completely isolated, removed from civilization, and something did traumatize them, what would they do? How would that look? So a specific kind of pinpoint moment, not really, but it was just something that I think was built from, I guess, that original idea and the themes that I'm interested in film. And then it was just a matter of just putting pen to paper and gradually sort of crafting from that point. But it all originated really from that fascination with trauma and how trauma can be visually represented on screen.
So you called it like in your synopsis you called it a more of like an avant-garde or like European flavor
Yeah,
kind of horror film. But it does have that horror conventions, even the way you kind of set the film up,
yeah,
right? You know,
yep,
a girl, young, attractive girl alone in a house. It's got that
yeah,
trope, right? And it's like, but then you realize there's depth, there's nuance to this character. It's not just a horror film. There's something
yeah.
more to it.
Absolutely. I always like thinking about the horror genre in terms of firstly thinking it's horror and you need to attract an audience and to get into festivals with a short film, there needs to be something familiar for audiences. So it is using those tropes. It
Yeah.
is playing, firstly using them, but then playing around with them and trying to find a unique angle. And so for me in this film and in my other films, it's always the single take and using the single long take as a way of immersing the audience into the space with the characters and playing around with that and how that looks on screen visually. So yes, there is intentional kind of European tropes and
Yeah.
a European flavor, very much inspired by Suspiria by Dario Argento and a lot of the 1970s giallo films. And David Lynch is a not really a horror filmmaker, but a filmmaker that was now very sad, a filmmaker that did play around with image and sound and
Yeah.
represent the psychological and what was buried and what was repressed,
Yeah.
psychologically conflicted
Well, some
characters.
can
So
argue
yes,
that he did make some horror films, right? David Lynch.
he
Uh,
did. Yes, he did make some horror films.
yeah, there's influence in there, and it's so funny that I
Yes,
was watching the
absolutely.
film, and it's like, oh, very, that cliche phrase Lynchian, right? But then it's like, and he
Yeah.
just passed away, and you have him in your bio, in your director statement. You mentioned David Lynch in your director statement, right? So
Yes,
yeah,
he's always been a filmmaking idol of mine, and yeah, he has made horror films, and I think I would almost position Lynch as a bit of a horror adjacent, so not strictly horror, but he was this filmmaker that he just fused kind of a whole range of genres and ideas together, and really for him it was all about that subconscious repressed state that human beings get in, psychologically conflicted characters, and thinking about how that can be presented on screen through dream logic and through image and sound, and what we can do with image and sound in combination. So yeah, very much inspired by Lynch. Certainly my top couple of filmmakers, and so yeah, the European influence is definitely there, but within those tropes, it's
yeah.
still trying to find something that is unique and feels fresh and kind of revamps or does something a little different with tropes. And so it was the single take for me in the second part of the film, but also the no dialogue
But
and
even the
trying to
beginning of the
communicate a
film, right,
story
where you're kind of
visually.
creeping up on her from behind on the couch, her looking into the mirror, right, the foggy mirror, like, and it
Yes.
gets her nostalgic about the past, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it's a film that really is about a character that has lost something, that
yeah,
is traumatized from that experience, is has isolated herself from the rest of the world. And this kind of farmhouse structure space that she lives in is both a physical and a metaphorical location for her. It's a space that she's in, but it's also literally, but also a space that she's kind of resting in her psychology as well. And it's really about
yeah.
the character confronting that and then seeing that in front of her manifested as she begins to kind of grapple with what has happened, and as she starts to confront those demons, she sees those demons in sort of figurative form throughout the film. So there's many interpretations, and it's been really interesting. Different people interpreting the film in really different ways, which is
Yeah.
some that were what I intended, but also some that kind of fall outside that. And that's why film's such a great medium, because it invites a lot of that subjective experience. And it's been fascinating listening to different people's
But,
perspectives on it.
but it's the way you shot it. Like it's like a we're like a fly in the wall. We're like observing her.
Yeah.
It's not from her point of view. It's from the audience's point of view. Like we're seeing her vulnerability,
Yeah.
right? So
Absolutely. Yeah. Just that fly on the wall, that kind of the sense from being an audience that you are omniscient at all times. You're voyeuristically in the space with the character. You're experiencing it alongside her. And what we did intentionally was the different shooting style based on the different state of the film. So we obviously start the film with a camera that is static and is a little further away from the
yeah.
character. And then as the panic sets in, and as we start to move into sort of the more horror elements of the film, the camera literally pushes in and becomes handheld and immerses the audience into that panicked, frazzled state of mind that she's in.
So you got the first part of the film where like where you're introducing the character, introducing the setting, and then you got the bathroom scene, right, where she's like naked and on the floor in the bathroom, and then you do this like fade to black or fade out. It's like 5, 6 seconds, and then turn the camera on. She's sitting down, and then yeah, you're in handheld. So you go from
Yeah,
like a really steady film, and then you're like handheld. Then you follow her, right? The long
yeah.
shot, right? So then, yeah, you kind of change your style, your directing style.
Absolutely. It was a risk, and it was one of those things that for some people might look a little odd. For me, I've always thought of the cinematic, medium and film as and cameras within that as being characters in on of themselves and expressing through camera. So it was really, as director, my way of showing the audience that we were in a new chapter in the film, and using camera as a way of mimicking the psychological state of the character. At the beginning of the film, she's isolated, she is despondent, she's a statue. And I remember in the screenplay, actually, there is a line where she's sitting on the couch, still as a statue, just looking with a blank expression ahead into nothingness. And the camera, I feel in that moment, if it was too invasive, it would sort of take away from that idea of a almost this empty shell character existing, almost just floating within this vacant space. And so pulling the camera back and having it static kind of gives it that essence of something that is just still and where there's no life, there's no movement. But then as the character, starts to grapple with and consciously experience
Mhm.
the trauma, that's the best time to push the camera in, because that's obviously where panic sets in. And I want the audience to feel uncomfortable in that sequence. I want them to feel every breath, every movement, every moment of that with her. And as the scene progresses as well, we push in even further and even closer. So we're literally at the point of catharsis at the end, where kind of there is this sense of, she's had enough and she's on the ground. The camera's right there. The colors have been pumped up. The whole set is bathed in red. The sounds at its top echelon, it's crescendoing, and we want the audience to almost like, nails on a chalkboard. We want them to almost just be screaming with her that enough is enough. We've had enough.
Yeah.
We're feeling too uncomfortable by this. So it was intentionally to jar the audience and make them feel that real sense of uncomfortableness, and doing that by essentially immersing them into her space.
Okay, so let's talk about your actress, right? Because
Yep.
like you said, it's like there's no dialogue. Besides the flashbacks, she's by herself, right?
Yeah.
And she's got to act like she's by herself, even though, like, you know, breaking the fourth wall, there is a crew there. You're
Yep.
there, the cinematographer's there. If you have a camera up,
Yeah.
you know what I mean, sound, whatever. So basically, there's people there. But then, so tell me about finding her, because this is a pretty interesting performance, and it's not easy to do, right? And it's like even from the audition tape, like,
Yeah.
what do you audition? I'm just curious about the process finding her.
Yeah, this one was interesting. So Nicole Pastor, the actor that played the role of Kylie in the film, I already had known her. Like I had a connection with her over a number of years, and Nicole
Okay,
was an actor that I didn't actually audition for this role. So I auditioned for the role of Dave, who's
the male, yeah.
the male character, so Jacob Saunders, who plays that role. So we auditioned for that role.
He looks a little like
But
you. I
Nicole,
thought maybe it was you for a bit.
thank you. Yeah, no, Jacob was Jacob did a really
I didn't
good
know if that was
job, and
subconscious or not, that you casted like someone who looked similar to you in that role.
maybe it was an unconscious
Yeah.
thing. I think what we were going for with Jacob's character was we wanted someone in those flashbacks and in those moments that we see where we see this sort of idyllic representation of the past as Kylie, Nicole's character, is experiencing it. We wanted a character that had a sense of stature on screen presence, and Jacob as an actor and what he brought to the screen in those fleeting moments was this real sense of ease and calm, and someone that was in control at all times. And so that was really important, that we kind of got someone that embodied that and was able to have this sense of presence on screen. And Nicole was someone that, to go back to your original question, that I knew. I didn't audition. We had wanted to work together for a number of
Okay.
years, and this was a role that I kind of partly wrote for her, with her sort of in mind. And then as I was crafting and writing the screenplay and thinking about how Kylie would present on screen, it seemed a natural fit. So that one wasn't an audition, but Jacob was auditioned, and I think that the two of them complement each other beautifully on screen. And Nicole's role was a challenging one. It was really tough. She did a lot of work. My process for directing and working with actors is, it's all about trust. It's a relationship that you build, sorry, in not directing actors in a traditional sense, and this is just for my own personal filmmaking style, but facilitating a performance and giving an actor the conditions and the framework of the scene and what needs to happen, and then allowing the actor to play and allowing the actor to embody and seeing what they come up with in the moment, and then from that point with each take kind of guiding and shaping and doing quite a bit of upfront work with the actor even before the shoot in building the character, building backstory, even for a short film, even though the audience don't see that backstory on screen, it facilitates performance and it helps the actor understand who they're playing, the shoes of the character that they're portraying. So Nicole and I did quite a bit of work on that backstory, limited rehearsals because we wanted the performances to be spontaneous, fresh. So lots of work on building a sense of trust, on building the framework, building character, and then just trusting that Nicole would have it. And we only did the single take scene, the sort of the big signature scene of the
Yeah.
film a
How
few
long is that
times.
shot, by the way?
That shot, how long is it now? I believe it's around 7 or so minutes
Yeah,
in
so
the
it's half your
film.
film, basically, right?
Yes, it is longer. We had a little bit of, obviously we cut in, we had her sitting on the edge of the bed for longer, and then there were moments afterwards where we kept the camera rolling, but all up in the actual film, I think it's around 7 or so minutes, and that's some pretty intense acting from Nicole, so she does a really good job
And how many takes did
there
you
in
do?
carrying that.
How many
What was
takes
that?
did you
Sorry.
do? How many
So
takes did
it
you
was
do?
I think it was about 3 takes. So
Okay.
it was, I think the second take was the one that we ended up going with from memory. The first one was probably, I think the first couple were the better performances. And probably the third one, yeah, because the performance style is so taxing that an actor's not going to be able to give you everything that they did in the early takes on a third or fourth take because they've spent all of their energy. So the third take, Nicole, was excellent, but the spontaneity was lost because that can obviously only be given on early takes. And
Yeah.
probably from a technical point of view, the third one was the best, but still really happy with the technical execution of the take that we ended up using. And for me, it's all about performance. You can smooth over technical issues. There's always going to be
Sure.
something that pops up in a single take, a shadow on the wall. There's going to be glitches with camera. It's not going to be perfect. Scott, the cinematographer, did an excellent job, really fantastic. Nikon gaffing, actually practically lighting the set and actually having the reds and the blues sort of fade in and up during the take was really great as well. Uh, but I always go for the performance. And so the take that we went with was Nicole's best performance by a long shot, and that's the one that we went with.
All right, so can we talk about the end of the film?
Yeah, absolutely. We can.
So it's I'm going to call it the shadow character.
Yep.
How is that done?
So the shadow character was a sort of a black costume that one of the production assistants,
Okay.
Dom, wore. So it was
So they
it
got
was
a
a
performance then.
so it was a performance. So it was a performance that required blocking, obviously, and intentional movements, and to be in sync with Nicole as they're confronting each other. And then there's obviously some action that does occur. So the actor was wearing a black costume, and then the effect was done in post-production
Okay.
by our visual effects person, Peter. So that was added to give this figure a sense of the macabre and the ethereal, the supernatural, but also as we sort of fade away from the effect and we then see this entity in its kind of true essence and form, we're sort of suggesting that perhaps this thing is part supernatural, part metaphorical extension, part almost literal rebirth of Nicole's character as she's suddenly confronted and dealt with her trauma. There's obviously quite a few people have interpreted this character in this moment in a number of ways, but really it is about her confronting her demons and then her quite literally carving and slaughtering that particular version of herself. So that thing, the black figure, we'll call it,
Mm.
is a metaphorical extension of her psyche. And so there's lots of those kind of ideas going on there, which is really where the David Lynch influence kind of comes from a little bit as well. It reminds me of, and one thing I was very conscious of when making it was, Mystery Man in Lost Highway, like thinking about characters that are metaphorical extensions of other characters' psyches and playing around with the subconscious rather than the literal. Those were things that I was very much interested in.
Yeah. Have you seen the movie Enemy?
Yes, yes, I have.
Yeah.
Yes.
Where like, would you consider that a horror film?
Or yes, yes, I think probably horror hybrid. That's probably one that maybe seeped in. And by horror hybrid, I'm more referring to something that doesn't subscribe traditionally from a sort of a structural trope point of view, but something that has lots of horror elements. But maybe something like that seeped into my subconscious. It wasn't sort of an overt reference, but I think someone that's watched many horror films,
Mhm.
all of these influences and all of these films and tropes, they kind of just
Sure.
get mangled into each other. So you just I think on an unconscious level as a horror filmmaker, you're probably referencing thousands of films that you've seen without realizing that you're actually referencing them. But that's a really interesting film, that one.
No, no, just because like it's got that kind of tone. Not it's you made a completely different film, but it's the subconscious kind of
Yeah,
like with people don't haven't seen the film. Like I don't want to. Basically, it's pretty
yeah,
fucking great, right? But it's like
yep,
and but he's like he thinks there's a doppelganger, but it's
yes,
I don't want to give anything away, but basically it's just like your
yes.
character. Is your character like a demon who's killing her, or is it just her all along that's killing her, right?
Yeah, that's the question.
Right?
And quite a few people, as I mentioned, have interpreted that differently. My intention was to have this character as uh, that metaphorical extension of her trauma that she's confronting, and it's as though the old self in confronting, because really what I'm exploring is about the dangers of repressed trauma and how when we do experience trauma, PTSD, we bury things away and we don't quite realize how the effect that can have on our lives moving forward. And these things can rear their ugly heads at unexpected moments in the future. And so when they do, it's always better to confront and to take and look at head on rather than trying to shy away from it. So in that moment, a traumatic experience that she has been avoiding, that she's buried down as deep as she can, it's suddenly there right in front of her. And then it's as though that's a moment of catharsis and growth. So it's the arc that the character's on, a journey to growth and to the next chapter of her life. So there's this sense of her metaphorically carving her old self and then being reborn in this new form. And
But
that's why,
that's why I'm interested in I'm glad you want to talk about it because I thought that she was going to destroy, like, take down the dark figure or whatever. But
yep,
you have the dark figure taking her down, right? So it's like,
yes,
so
yes,
she's destroying. You know what I mean? Trying to say it's like I thought that's where it was going when I first saw it. It's like, okay, she's just gonna attack this
yep.
figure and win the day, right? Like,
You know what? That's actually, I'm glad that that's great feedback for me as a
yeah,
filmmaker because it means that, because really I'm just trying to subvert expectation and
sure,
subvert those familiar well-worn tropes that we would that we were discussing earlier. So if that's where it seemed like it was leading and then there was a shift, that moment of the violence at the end is meant to kind of pack a punch and it's meant to be shocking. And I think what we try to do to sell the idea of some rebirth that is occurring is when we sort of push the camera slightly, and so we sort of pan across and then tilt back up to the figure's face, and then the veil of the supernatural kind of effect, we fade down from that, and then we see this figure in its true form. So to boil it down, it is essentially Kylie confronting herself and her demons,
Yeah.
and then her almost in doing that, the old self is slaughtered, and then a new self is able to be reborn that is essentially pushing to a new chapter. This is obviously, and quite a few people have mentioned the final moment where a lot of people actually have questions about sort of what she did in the past and whether or not Kylie actually is as innocent as maybe it appears on surface. And so that's an interesting perspective to that quite a few people have brought
Yeah.
as well. What is it that Kylie's actually traumatized from, and what was the actual cause of death
Yeah.
of her ex-partner?
Yeah. That's the thing, right? Like it's like that's what you want to if you want to expand it, like
Yeah,
that's like and you could take it in different ways, right? Like she like
absolutely.
the extreme, like she killed him, right?
Yep.
And then or like he's abusive and then or he killed him or he's a sweet guy and
Yeah.
she's fucked up. You know what I mean? Like there's a million different ways to take it, right? So or maybe she
This
just
and that's
traumatized
what's
because he
great about
died,
it.
right?
Yeah. And I love those. I love those interpretations. This is why I love horror, because horror, look, I mean, all cinema is fantastic. I think horror you can play with good versus evil. You can play with human psychology and behavior and what motivates people. And you can use horror tropes and horror visual symbols and violence and gore to suggest and indicate so much about human beings and humanity and the way that we process trauma, the way that we relate to each other. This is and that lends itself to multiple interpretations and that subjectivity of the experience. So I'm glad that you picked up on some of that. That's really great, and it's been interesting to listen to people and what they think.
All right, so before we leave you, you mentioned the blog interview that you're going to start a horror podcast, and you're going to talk about your deep dive. You're still doing that, the horror podcast?
Yes, yes, I am. I'm
Okay.
still doing
So you
that.
just
So
had
that's
confused look
something
on your
I've.
face. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, no, no, no. Sorry, no, no, no. I would the confused look on the face was more me remembering, because I didn't actually remember that I had mentioned that, and then
Yeah.
I'm like, oh yeah, I did mention it. No, no, that is still going
No,
ahead.
you
So
didn't
that's
mention
some.
it. I just have that. I just have that
No, no, no.
sense
That,
with you.
that
Yeah.
that's fine. It's a nice plug for it,
It's another
actually.
horror kind of element, right? Where
Yeah.
I'm just
So
reading
look,
your mind.
outside of filmmaking, I'm also a university teacher. So I did my PhD so I'm working up at QUT in Brisbane at the moment in Australia, and my PhD was on Wolf Creek, the Australian horror film Wolf Creek by Greg McLean from 2005. So all of my kind of academic life and study has revolved around cinema, but horror and lots of Australian horror as well. So what I'm essentially doing with this podcast, so I've got some episodes recorded at the moment. It hasn't been released yet because I'm getting some intros and things designed at the
Mhm.
moment. So I'm just waiting on that, and then I'll put it all together soon in the not too distant future. But it's really giving a kind of a bit of an academic dive into different films, different filmmakers, and what I'm really interested in is exploring horror films within their production context. So thinking about not just this is a horror film, this is what it reminds me of. It looks cool. I like it. I don't like it. It's more doing that, but also thinking about what these films represent more broadly about culture, society, the
Mhm.
world. These things that I teach my students around how cinema in general is a mirror to the world, and how it teaches us a lot about global events and anxieties and things. So I'll do quite a bit of that. So contextualizing Wolf Creek in its post 9/11 era, looking at the visual disposition of cinema in the 5, 10 years after 9/11, for example, and how Wolf Creek with Saw and Hostel and these films, how it responded to that, thinking about the films on that deeper analytical level and the actual format of it yet, whether or not it's a film, an episode, or
Yeah.
there's a director,
Oh,
an episode. I'm not exactly sure yet. There might be some guests on, but that's something that I'll be launching in the not too
you
distant
talked
future.
about 9/11, right? Which is defines, it seems like it defined your, I don't know how old you are, but it seems like it defined you a great deal. But think about COVID, right? Think about the horror
Yes.
films that are already being influenced by the COVID era, right? So
Oh, absolutely. It's really fascinating. I'm in my mid 30s, so I distinctly remember, as everyone does, and from an Australian
you were a
perspective,
kid, you were
I think
just a
everyone
child, I
just
guess, when it happened.
exactly.
Yeah.
I was in grade, I believe I was in year 7 at the time. And so, and everyone remembers, where they were,
Yeah.
what was happening at that moment. And so that was really defining. And the cinema that came out afterwards was fascinating. But you're right, this post-COVID era, the influx of apocalyptic, post-apocalyptic style cinema and television series. There's so much that is coming out from South Korea, for example. There's some really fascinating films. Virus 32 is a really interesting one. There's Gold, which was an Australian co-production film set in the Australian outback starring Zac Efron, but it was an Australian co-production. There's this really big slew of films and television series that are exploring kind of societies in this post-apocalyptic context. Society and civilization breaks down and people need to survive somehow. How does that look? And so I think the existential questions that people asked during the COVID era, we're seeing that
Yeah.
in cinema in this really interesting cycle at the moment. So that is something that I would be interested in having a look at as well in in the podcast. But Speak No Evil's another really good one that's been released in the last couple of years. Virus 32, as I mentioned, is a really fantastic one
Yeah.
as well.
So before the last point, I had you for a long time because I'm curious about, because you just mentioned your age and David Lynch. So a lot of his movies were kind of done, when you were probably too young to
Yeah.
watch them, or you were
Yep.
even weren't
Yep.
even born. So when he died, we do our cinema, one of our cinemas in downtown Toronto at the Carlton, and there's like a lot of young people going to university who work there, and they're in their 20s, but they love film, right? That's why it's probably they work
Yep.
at the cinema.
Yep.
And they were so upset about David
Yeah.
Lynch, and they even have an
Yeah.
RAP at the front of the thing. Like when
Yeah.
Gene Hackman died, I was telling the manager, I'm like, you got to switch it to Hackman, right? Like, and he's like,
Yeah.
oh, we love Lynch. So, anyways, my point is that there's just this generation, your young generation loves David Lynch, even though
Yes.
like I said, most of his content wasn't even there when you weren't even be able to watch it during the time. So I'm curious, why do you think such your generation loves his? It's a general question. I'm just curious why
Yeah, no,
such an
that's
influence.
a good question. I mean, I think from a broader societal perspective, I
Yeah.
think there is a general interest in the retro and looking backwards, and people being a lot more interested in the past music, past fashion,
Is that
past
because
film.
the present is not very good? I don't know.
Possibly. I think there could be
Yeah.
something in that. I think from a film study perspective, a lot of it does generate from a lot of film courses that do teach.
Okay.
I teach quite a few courses on, introduction to film studies, for
Okay.
example, and a lot of the when I was a student and I was learning these units, Lynch's films were used quite a bit. I remember Lost Highway being used in some of the early screen units that I taught in. Mulholland Drive was used. Twin Peaks
Yeah.
in a television unit was used as one of the opening weeks. And so I think it's because it originates from film units and learning about film and craft at that level. And it comes from how Lynch used image and sound. I think we get so caught up in exposition and being told through character dialogue what narratives
Yeah.
are. And whereas if you have a filmmaker like Lynch that really used image and sound in a very different way, everything was figurative, everything was metaphorical, every sound, every image had its purpose. And so I think when we break down Lynch's films and we look at them as text, there's so much that students and teachers and scholars can learn from him. It's why he's probably one of the most theorized filmmakers that has ever lived. So his works cross over so many different genres that there's something really interesting, I think, for most film lovers to find in his films. And we're all interested in psychology and humans and what motivates us. And Lynch is exploring all of this stuff. So I think it does come from that broader historic that broader societal. Everyone's looking back to the past, and then I think there is just an ongoing fascination with Lynch from film studies and also sort of film buff circles and
Yeah.
cinephilia as well. That is a really nice thing, and I hope it never gets lost. I think his work will endure, and it's always going to be really popular within those circles.
And there's a lot of influence of his work now. I see it all the time,
Yes,
right? And like
yes,
especially like even filmmakers like yourself. But there's like I think what you're kind of saying in a roundabout way is that there's nuance to his films, and they're not
yes.
being the audience isn't being spoon fed the plot. The audience isn't being spoon fed. Okay, this is who this character is. This is what this character is all about. They're all kind of strange and they're all kind of human, right? But and even the plots, like, but you're not being told,
Yeah.
okay, this is what's going to happen next, right? Like it's you got to really pay
Yep.
attention to what's going
You've
on,
got to
and
pay
it's
attention.
but it's all there. There's a payoff too, right? Well,
Yeah.
maybe not Twin
Yeah.
Peaks, but there's a there's a payoff, right, to all his work,
Oh,
right? So
absolutely. Like something like Mulholland Drive, it's
yeah.
one that you have to watch,
Oh yeah,
I think multiple times to
100, yeah,
really
100,
kind
yeah,
of grapple with what's going on. But the way I've always tried to explain Lynch to students who might watch Lynch and won't understand it is my response to them is that's kind of not the point. You're not meant to understand in a literal sense. It's dream logic. So you're meant to kind of peel back the layer of what you're seeing.
yeah,
Think about what is being represented more on a metaphorical or in a metaphorical sense. And then think about how the visuals and the sounds are trying to communicate these very subliminal, subconscious ideas to you. So it's literal lens
yeah.
of analysis won't work for Lynch. It's appreciating and almost allowing yourself to be drawn into the figurative experience. And I always explain it like, you've got kind of a straight line and that straight line is our experience of the world and the way that we understand consciousness. And Lynch's world and Lynch's characters, they're not aliens over this side,
Yeah.
but they're also not humans or they're not experiencing humanity as we do in a literal sense. They're kind of deviating slightly. They're almost just a little bit off
Yeah,
that
yeah.
line.
Like
And
us,
so that's
like most people, right?
yes, yes. And Lynch's characters are so idiosyncratic.
Yeah,
They're not aliens, but you watch them and there's just something slightly off
yeah,
about the way they deliver the dialogue, the performance style. It's a bit too performed.
yeah,
And so it's about understanding that that is meant to represent something that is just a little deviation
yeah.
from the way that we speak, the way that we experience the world around us. It's fascinating, fascinating filmmaker. I try to be honest, probably every film class I teach, I bring Lynch up. It's
There you go.
in some way. He always finds his way in there.
Maybe that's why. Maybe that's why these people like it was just so interesting. Like,
Yeah,
and then they're doing
absolutely.
like
No,
all these like
he
five
was
minute,
fantastic.
$5 movies where like you're watching
Yep.
all these David Lynch films are now being
Yeah.
seen at these cinemas now, and like, but you just made me think of something too because in my era, like I'm old, is that I couldn't just like get my hands on a film. Like I could like even if you
Yep.
go into like the
Yep.
video store, you had to like really dig to get some old films. Now it's like there's a lot of things in your
Yeah,
hand, right? Where you could just go on a streaming service or you could just search on your Fire Stick, whatever, and you could find things faster, right? So
absolutely.
yeah.
Oh, it's such a different world. I mean, I say this to my students all the time. Like you know, we live in an era of digital clutter and instant gratification, and everything, anything you want to watch, you can watch at any time, at any moment, in any way you want to. There would be a way of accessing anything, and it wasn't always like that. It was a very
It
different
was never like that.
world that
It
we
was never
lived in.
like
Never
that.
like that at all.
This is
And
the
even
only
going back,
time it's been like that. Yeah.
absolutely. But
Yeah.
even going back to the studio era, pre-television, even into television, I even mentioned to my class the other week, back in those days, the only way to watch a film was at the cinemas.
Yeah.
You had to, whatever they were exhibiting, the theaters, that's all you could watch.
Yeah.
And then people would see a film in the 1930s and 40s. They would never have a chance to see that film again unless it was being rerun at the theater or unless it was having a run on television once television was introduced until video, VHS. But even then, you were only able to watch what was in the video store. And
Yeah.
so the digital era, the cinematic literacy and how we see films today is so incredibly different. Like we're able to pick films apart and access everything. So with that really should come a greater appreciation and understanding of the cinematic form. So someone like a Lynch is going to be much more accessible because he can be. There's a way of watching his films, but at the same time, there's also maybe a little too much. And so in a world where there's too much choice, maybe it actually is a little bit more difficult to kind of have one or two filmmakers that are in a more
Do
privileged
you know what the
position.
number one movie, what the number, sorry, the number one TV show was like from March 2020 to like the end of 2020 when everybody was in COVID? Was The Sopranos. And that was the number one show. And that show
Yep.
retired in 2007. So it was a 13-year-old show. 13 years is a long
Yep.
time, right? It's a whole decade. And that
Yes.
was the most
Yes.
popular show. It's like
Doesn't
it's
surprise
there,
me.
right? Because
It
it's
doesn't
great.
surprise me.
That's
It's
why.
such a, I mean,
Yeah.
it's probably the first show I think I watched. Maybe Breaking Bad. One of the first early shows where I felt like I was watching high quality
Yeah.
cinematic television. Dexter actually was probably one of the very early ones in
I
that
just
longer
it's funny.
sort of drama
I just binge
form.
watched
The
that
Sopranos is
show.
such a great
Yeah.
show. Yeah.
Yeah, it's yeah, it's good. There's some really good, yeah, there's some really good moments, but it's like,
Yeah,
yeah,
it's a good character study.
right, yeah,
Gandolfini
yeah.
that was a very, very nuanced character,
That's a
that
show
one.
that's a show you could talk about your podcast. But anyways, but basically, but I guess the point is that greatness will carry on, right, in this era because
Absolutely.
forever. Because if you got something
Yeah.
great, it's going to be there forever, right? Where like
Yep.
I was just talking in the last podcast about this movie called The Apartment from 1960, which was
Ah,
it's a
yes, Billy
brilliant
Wilder.
film. I don't know if you've seen it, but
Yeah.
it's
Yes.
you've seen it. So basically, that's like a film that, like you said, nobody
Yep.
watched it for 20 years until
Yeah.
VHS came out, right? So
Yes. Yes.
and
And a lot of these films return, and I think why maybe something like someone like a Lynch and a lot of these classics they endure is because their themes and the the tropes and what characters experience and go through, it's universal. It is timeless. Social cultural context and the world that the characters in films live in. We move on as a society and things are different and what we're seeing might change, but what the characters actually go through and the human experience is something that doesn't really shift. And I mean, Lynch's worlds are they're not really defined by any specific era. There's a big technology emphasis in a lot of his films, but the existentialism and the themes are so universal. And this is why the coming of age genre is another one that endures, because it doesn't matter whether it's Rebel Without a Cause or from the 50s or John Hughes films from the 80s or today's coming of age films. Audiences today can still get something out of Rebel Without a Cause. Different world, different context,
yeah,
but the angst and what the characters experience, these are things that are universal and are timeless. So I think this is why there's more access, but there is also this through that interest in the past, younger people are
Mm.
finding media that still resonates with them.
Yeah.
And I think they're really grappling and yeah, they're really connected to
Yeah.
that.
Well, I just saw Mean Girls, and Mean Girls is Rebel Without a Cause. Like 60 years later, I
Yep.
don't like
Yes,
it's not,
exactly.
they just
Exactly.
use comedy as
Yes.
instead of drama, but
Yep.
basically it's the
Yep.
same thing, right? So, anyways,
Yes.
man,
It absolutely is the same thing. Same format,
yeah,
same experience. The younger characters are dealing with the same issues of angst and identity and
100%.
transition,
Yeah.
just different contexts.
All right, man. Congratulations on the film. I hope it does well. It
Thank you
looks like
so
it's
much.
doing amazing on the festival circuit. It's pretty
Thank
great.
you.
And I know you're doing your podcast. I know you're doing your teaching, but trying to keep making movies because you're onto something.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me on. And just really quickly, you guys are doing really well with the festival. I think this is a really unique festival that offers something quite different for filmmakers. And so I think you guys have really sort of hit at something about giving filmmakers a bigger platform, more scope, more access to a wider audience. So I love what you guys do. I think it's a really great festival.
I appreciate that. It really means a lot. All right, let's talk again when you make your next film.
Cheers. Thank you.